In part 1, I demonstrated that the 12th and 18th dynasties were one and the same period of history. I have shown that the 13th and 14th dynasties, which simply comprise further names belonging to these 12th/18th dynasty kings and queens, have become a dumping ground by archaeologists when they have been unable to assign the names elsewhere. I have demonstrated how the 21st dynasty kings and queens have added their own text to the 18th dynasty monuments, thereby confusing the archaeological record. I have also demonstrated that the 4th, 5th and 6th dynasties are spurious. I went on to show that this 12th/13th/14th/18th dynasty was contemporary with the Davidic Solomonic period, and I showed you a number of bas-reliefs showing Israelites, and drew your attention to the fact that they had pointed beards, fringes on their clothing, and in some cases the blue thread was evident, all of these being in accordance with biblical commandments. To reiterate what I said at the start of part 1, do not be intimidated by the fact that these pharaohs had many names. Just concentrate instead on the arguments being put forward. We shall now continue our reconstruction of the Egyptian history by looking at the 19th dynasty, this being what is known as the Ramessid period. We mentioned earlier that the monuments of the 18th dynasty king Thutmose III were appropriated by Menkaperre Thutmose of the 21st dynasty. This practice of appropriating earlier monuments, which was noticed by the Swiss Egyptologist Edouard Navel, was a common occurrence. Only archaeologists seem to be fully unaware of it. We here have two representations of Menmatre Seti, a king who has been called Seti I. Do these look like two different people to you? Notice how the chin on the king of the right is receding. The physiognomy of the one on the left resembles that of Ramesses II, so I would surmise that he is the father of Ramesses II, whilst the one on the right, even though they both have the very same names, is clearly a different person. The written records even show that there were two kings with the name Seti during this period. Menmatre Seti I was the father of Ramesses II. Another king by the name of Seti was the father of Ramses I. To save any confusion for when we look at Seti II, we shall call these two kings Seti Ia and Seti Ib. Seti I was called Sethus by Sir Alan H. Gardiner. Seti Ia was likewise called Sethus by Herodotus. Next on the throne after Anisis was Sethus, the high priest of Hephaestus. He is said to have neglected the warrior class of the Egyptians and to have treated them with contempt, as if he had been unlikely to need their services. He offended them in various ways, not least by depriving them of the 12 acres of land which each of them had held by special privilege under previous kings. As a result, when Egypt was invaded by Sennacherib, the king of Arabia and Assyria with a great army, not one of them was willing to fight. Sir Alan H. Gardiner even tells us that part of a charter issued by Seti I was aimed at the vizier, the officials, the courts of judges, the king's son of Cush, the troop captains, the superintendents of gold, the mayors and heads of villages of Upper and Lower Egypt, the charioteers, and so on. This charter shows that the privileges of the temple staff were being infringed and were subject to being seized personally, moved from district to district, commandeered for ploughing or reaping, prevented from fishing or fowling, have their cattle stolen, and so forth. Also, any official who did not exact justice from the offenders was himself to be severely punished. Paragraph after paragraph deals with such matters, but it has to be confessed that the entire decree is very carelessly drafted and leaves the impression rather of artificial legalistic form than of precise legal enactment. This is precisely what Herodotus tells us, but because of Manetho's cleverly contrived Egyptian king lists, archaeologists have dated Seti I around 800 years too early. Let us now take a look at a controversial issue concerning the Ramesside period. It should be pointed out that not even the Greeks can agree on the order of kings during this period, with some placing Ramesses II at the end of the 18th dynasty, others placing him both at the beginning of the 19th dynasty and the end of the 18th. This is what Josephus records. I'm afraid that this slide is a little bit busy, but I can't see any way of reducing the amount of information. However, in an attempt to simplify things a little, I have added in brackets the names of the people he is actually referring to. After him came Armasis-Miamun, that is Ramses II, also known as Necho II, for 66 years and 2 months. After him Amenephis, that is Seti II, for 19 years and 6 months. After him came Sethossis and Rameses. Sethossis is better known to us as Pharaoh Mernptah, the person the Greeks called Apries and who appears in the Bible as Pharaoh Khafre, whilst his brother Rameses is the king archaeologists have called Siptah. So 2 brethren, the former of whom had a naval force, and in a hostile manner destroyed those that met him upon the sea. But as he slew Rameses, that is Siptah, in no long time afterward, so he appointed another of his brethren, Harmaes, better known to us as Ammon-Meses, or more correctly Ammon-Amasis, to be his deputy over Egypt. He also gave him all the other authority of a king, but with these only injunctions, that he should not wear the diadem, nor be injurious to the queen, the mother of his children, and that he should not meddle with the other concubines of the king, while he, that is Mernptah Khafre Ma'at, made an expedition against Cyprus and Phoenicia, and besides against the Assyrians and the Medes. All of this might seem a little daunting to someone who is unfamiliar with these names. It does not help when the kings of the ancient world were known by a number of different names. In the first few years of his 6-year reign, Siptah was known as Ramses Siptah, and later as Mernptah Siptah. Josephus here calls him Ramses, brother to Sethossis. Sethossis is Seti Mernptah Khafre Ma'at, who we know from the Bible as Pharaoh Khafre. The Greeks called him Apries. The Greek writer Herodotus records, "There was no earlier king who was more fortunate than Apries. He ruled for 25 years, and in the course of his reign he attacked Sidon and fought a sea battle against the king of Tyre." Diodorus, another Greek writer, gives the following embellished account. He now includes Cyprus and Phoenicia, the places which Josephus tells us were conquered by Sethossis, that is Seti Mernptah Khafre Ma'at. 4 generations after Psammetichus, Apries was king for 22 years. He made a campaign with strong land and sea forces against Cyprus and Phoenicia, took Sidon by storm, and so terrified the other cities of Phoenicia that he secured their submission. He also defeated the Phoenicians and Cyprians in a great sea battle, and returned to Egypt with much booty. Note that, like Josephus' account of Sethos, Diodorus makes Apries, that is the biblical Pharaoh Khafre, conquer Cyprus and Phoenicia. Note also that Diodorus claims that Apries only ruled for 22 years, whilst Herodotus says 25. Basically, the later the writer, the more contrived these stories became. In the list of captives and slain recorded following his Libyan campaign, Mernptah has Shurdan, Shekelesh, Eqesh of the countries of the sea who had no foreskins. Further down his list, Mernptah states that the Eqesh were specifically the ones who had no foreskins. If the Eqesh were the inhabitants of Cyprus, it can be shown that Cyprus was at that time controlled by Phoenicians who were Israelites. Therefore, Mernptah might well have conquered Cyprus. When you put everything together, we obtain the following correlation. You will notice that the name which archaeologists are reading as Amun-Meses is to be more correctly read as Amun-Amasis. It can be shown that Ahmose II, the pharaoh who is usually identified by archaeologists as Amasis, actually lived during the Persian period a few hundred years later. Similarly, Yuchabra Necho, who is usually identified as Pharaoh Necho of the time of Josiah and Jehoiakim, was a Persian satrap. Such is the mess which we are having to contend with when we analyse the archaeological evidence correctly. Let us get one thing straight. Pharaoh Mernptah Khofre did not die a natural death. He died of asphyxiation. Herodotus informs us that, for a while Amasis let him, that is the jailed Apries or Mernptah Khofre Ma'at, stay in the palace and treated him well. But eventually the Egyptians complained that it was wrong of Amasis to look after someone who had been such a bitter enemy of theirs and of his. So Amasis handed Apries over to the Egyptians, who strangled him and buried him in his family tomb. Note that the Greek word used here means choked or throttled as opposed to strangled. Diodorus, who lived a couple of centuries later, gives a very different account. He tells us, when a little later all the rest of the native Egyptians also went over to Amasis, the king, that is Apries or Mernptah Khofre Ma'at, was in such straits that he was forced to flee for safety to the mercenaries, who numbered some 30,000 men. A pitched battle accordingly took place near the village of Maria, and the Egyptians prevailed in the struggle. Apries fell alive into the hands of the enemy and was strangled up to death. And Amasis, arranging the affairs of the kingdom in whatever manner seemed to him best, ruled over the Egyptians in accordance with the laws and was held in great favour. We can now demonstrate that Apries, who we are here identifying as Mernptah Khofre, actually choked to death as per the account given by Herodotus. However, this does not exclude the possibility that someone might have held him around the throat in a chokehold whilst he choked to death. According to a book on clinical forensic medicine, the most likely signs of strangulation are petechial hemorrhages, minute discoloured spots on the surface of the skin caused by an underlying ruptured blood vessel. On external examination, one would be hard put to diagnose asphyxia without them, we are told. In the worst case scenario, showers of pinpoint hemorrhages are to be seen widely distributed over the head and upper trunk. In other cases, it is more usual to see them scattered sparsely on the forehead, on inner and outer surfaces of the eyelids, on the conjunctivae, that is the delicate mucous membrane that covers the eyeball and the undersurface of the eyelid, on the face and on the front of the neck. In some instances, they will be found only behind the ears. An examination revealed that Mernptah's body was covered by an encrustation of sodium chloride, that is, salt. These salt deposits on the body will most likely have been produced as a result of a petechial hemorrhaging. X-rays have also revealed fractures in the heads of the femurs. These might also have been caused by the crowd who, in their anger, must have relentlessly kicked the body of the king when he had collapsed to the ground. Another curious feature of Mernptah's mummy is that the scrotum of the king is missing, and the exposed flesh had been covered with a layer of resin. This shows that he must have been castrated either shortly before his death, which is unlikely, or during the embalming process for reasons unknown. In his monuments, which depict his initial victories over the Libyans, Mernptah boasted how he castrated his enemies. When his armies later suffered a heavy defeat at the hands of the Libyans, the Egyptians blamed him for their losses. They clearly castrated him the same way that he had castrated the Libyans. We are also told that the body was wrapped in a fine sheet of linen which hid a hastily wrapped mummy and a mass of loose rags which were the remains of the original wrappings. Mernptah's body cavity had been filled with a white cheesy material, probably decomposed butter and soda. This is not the sort of material one would expect to find in a mummy, whether of a king or any wealthy person, if its intended purpose was to preserve the body. All of this shows that the priest responsible for his burial did not show him the respect which a king would normally have been entitled to. Mernptah lost some of his teeth before his death. Some have seen this as evidence of dental surgery in ancient Egypt, thinking that the teeth had been deliberately removed. One of his teeth was found loose in his hypopharynx and only came to light when x-rayed. This tooth, which must have been knocked out along with the other missing teeth when he was set upon by his own countrymen, is clearly what caused his asphyxiation. This is clearly what he choked on. Seti Ia was called Sethos by Herodotus, who tells us that he was a contemporary of Sennacherib, king of Assyria. He was the father of Ramses I, also known as Necho I. Seti Ib was a contemporary of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, and was the father of Ramses II, also known as Necho II. Ramesses II, better known to us as Pharaoh Necho II, was a contemporary of Josiah and Jehoiakim, kings of Judah. According to the book of Jeremiah, Mernptah Khofra was a contemporary of Siddekiah, king of Judah, which raises a lot of questions as to how the long reigns of Pharaoh Necho and his son Seti II can be fitted into a time span of less than 20 years. The Israel Stela of Mernptah, which supposedly describes the state of the land of Israel after the exodus from Egypt, ironically describes the situation at the time of the exile, the inhabitants of the land of Judea having been taken captive at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Israel is no more, the Pharaoh tells us, which at least confirms the biblical statement that Pharaoh Khafra was king of Egypt at the end of Siddekiah's reign. The king who succeeded Mernptah, whose name has been read as Amon-Meses, is the person the Greeks called Amasis. For Amon-Meses we should read Amon-Amasis. Ramses III Nekhtar-neb-Khapesh Seti is the king better known to us as Nekhtar-Nebo I. He was a contemporary of Artaxerxes II, king of Persia, hence lived around 100 years after Amon-Meses. Ramses II, better known to us as Pharaoh Necho II, was a contemporary of Hattusilus III, king of Khatti. It is a known fact that Hattusilus III also used the name Katassar. We know this Katassar as Nebokatassar or Nebuchadnezzar, meaning that the king known as Hattusilus III is to be identified as Nebuchadnezzar II, hence supporting the claim that Ramses II was a contemporary of Josiah and Jehoiakim, kings of Judah. Knowing this, the Shosu chief who came out against Ramses II as he went north to engage in battle with Hattusilis III, and is portrayed on a granite door jamb in a temple at Deir el-Bakhri in Egypt being shot by an arrow, will undoubtedly be King Josiah. Notice once again the pointed beard. I should perhaps point out that archaeologists are claiming that Hattusilis III was a Hittite king. But, as leading Hittitologist Emil Forer stated, the Hittites were not Hittites at all. Having drawn attention to this statement by Emil Forer, Johannes Lehmann remarks that Forer put it so mildly that the implications of what he had said might well have escaped the likes of us. A survey of all the Boghazköy fragments, wrote Forer, has elicited that no less than 8 different languages occur in them. Apart from Sumerian, Akkadian, the language hitherto described as Hittite, but as we shall see more aptly termed Kaneshite, and Old Indic, Hattian, Proto-Hattian, Luwian and Palaic. Such is scholarship. Our first temptation when faced with Forer's rather convoluted syntax is to tot up the languages and see if there really are 8. There are, but Hittite isn't one of them. It is ironic that archaeologists have called these Chaldeans Hittites, and now that they have made such a bold claim and it has become an established teaching, people have difficulty in changing their ideas. There will even be people watching these videos who will fall into this category. It often takes decades before changes to any established doctrine become widely accepted. As Oliver R. Gurney aptly puts it, the name Hittite was given to this language by modern scholars as being the official language of the land of Hatti, and has been universally accepted. But it is strictly speaking incorrect. It is now generally agreed that the true name of the language is Nessite or Nessian, the language of Nessa or Kanesh. But despite this, the name Hittite is now so well established that it will probably never be abandoned. It should be noted that Nebuchadnezzar claimed to have conquered the whole area of Hattiland. It is interesting to note that the designation of Hattiland or land of Hattu included Ashkelon and the kingdom of Judah. According to one of the Assyrian and Babylonian chronicles, the 7th year, in the month Kislev, the king of Akkad, that is Nebuchadnezzar, mustered his army and marched to Hattu. He encamped against the city of Judah, and on the 2nd day of the month Adar, he captured the city and seized its king. As Donald J. Wiseman put it, the effects of the Babylonian victory were immediate and far-reaching. At that time, recorded the chronicler, Nebuchadnezzar conquered the whole area of Hatti, the geographical term Hatti including at this period the whole of Syria and Palestine. Note once again that archaeologists use the word Palestine to refer to the whole of the land of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar, also known as Hattusilis III, also known as Khasasar, therefore felt justified in considering himself king of Hatti. Without going into great detail, Mersilis II, the father of Hattusilis III, is identifiable as Nabopolassar, the father of Nebuchadnezzar II. Nabopolassar was called Pelesis by Diodorus and Nebuchadnezzar by Berosus. It can be shown that he was also known as Kandalanu, but let's not complicate things further. Despite all of this overwhelming evidence, archaeologists are still reluctant to accept that the kings of the ancient world had more than the one throne name, and are quick to criticize and judge anyone who dares to challenge their interpretations of the evidence. Let's now move on to the rulers who succeeded Ramses II, starting with Seti II, the son of Ramses II. The position of Yuzakeparura Setpenre Seti Mernptah, that is Seti II, has also posed a conundrum, with some inscriptions suggesting that he preceded Siptach Mernptah and Amenmeses, and some suggesting that he either succeeded them or co-ruled with Siptach and Amenmeses. Seti II's tomb had been vandalised at some early date. Many of the texts had been erased and subsequently restored. In a report published by Aidan Dodson in 1999, Dodson assumes that Seti II actually co-ruled with Amenmeses. This is because Dodson believes that it was this king, that is Amenmeses, who was responsible for the erasures. Because of this corruption of our understanding of Egyptian history, the dynasty under consideration having been dated by mainstream scholars 1,000 years too early, no one would have even considered the possibility that the tomb was vandalised by the Persian king Cambyses, who is said by Herodotus to have destroyed the temples of this period under consideration. As Dodson records, finally, the possibility that Amenmes was the agent for the erasures was suggested by Alan Gardiner and argued for by Rolf Krauss and the present writer, based on the reconstruction which places Amenmes as a Gegonkonig, that is opponent ruler, within the reign of Sethos II. Amenmes would then have mutilated the cartouches of his predecessor on seizing power in Thebes, restorations being made by Sethos II once the usurper had been driven out. Following this view, the decoration of the inner parts of the tomb would have been carried out in the last year or two of Sethos II's reign after he recovered the throne at Thebes. It has not even occurred to him that there might be two kings with the same name, the later king having usurped the tomb of the former. Continuing with these arguments, Peter Brand records, in some cases, as with the battle and cult scenes on the west side of the Cour de la Cachette at Karnak, Seti II merely substituted his name for that of his father Mernptah after the latter's cartouches had been erased by Amenmes. This assumption that Seti II substituted his name for Amenmes can be shown to be false, as Seti II will by that time have been long dead. It should be noted that the restorations in Seti II's tomb included an Egyptian hieroglyphic sign which is of late date and only makes a reappearance during the time of Ramses III. The figures are in very slightly raised relief, with details, especially the eyes, added in ink. The cartouches are interesting in that the Mun signs are of a distinctive type, relatively narrow with only 4 very prominent playing pieces shown, to be dubbed the 4-spike type. The solution is a lot simpler than anyone thinks. The truth of the matter is that the tomb of Seti II, son of Ramses II, has been usurped and re-engineered by another King Seti with exactly the same names and titles, but who lived nearly 2 centuries later. Here are 2 differing representations of Userkheparura Setpenre Seti II Mernptah from his tomb. Compare the picture on the left with his father Ramses II and brother Ramses Siptach. Now compare the picture on the right with his son Setnacht. Pay particular attention to the chins. Note also the similarity in the shape of the noses. This later king, in an attempt at forging a link with his predecessor, has appropriated the tomb and inscriptions of the earlier Seti II, thereby throwing confusion on the archaeological evidence. The chronological sequence of kings in the period following Ramses II has been the subject of much scholarly debate. Gaston Maspero tells us that the history of King Siptach and of Queen Tausrit consists for the time being of a very few facts founded on a very few monuments and a considerable number of hypotheses which have been suggested by the study of those few monuments to the modern writers on Egypt. The evidence from this period is still, to this day, extremely confusing and unclear. However, everyone is failing to understand the extent of the later appropriations which were occurring. For example, it has recently been discovered that Takhat, who was interred in the tomb of Amenmeses, and was originally assumed to have been Seti II's queen, was actually queen to Ramses IX. Similarly, Bakhet-Werel is believed to have been the consort of Amenmeses, a usurper in the reign of Seti II. Her remains have not been identified, but possibly have been found in Amenmeses' tomb alongside his mother Takhat. Bakhet-Werel has also been identified as the consort of Ramses IX. If she were the consort of Ramses IX, she would have been the mother of Ramses X. It is possible that a second Bakhet-Werel was named after an ancestral member. Bear in mind that this writer has already told us that Takhat has been redated to the time of Ramses IX of the later 20th dynasty. It is now recognised that Bakhet-Werel was not the consort of Amenmeses as Margaret Bunson claims. The inscriptions and portrait of Bakhet-Werel in Amenmeses' tomb were added at a much later date, and she now also has been redated to the time of Ramses IX. This means that there was only the one Bakhet-Werel, and that she lived during the time of Ramses IX. As Aidan Dodson records, Queen Bakhet-Werel, depicted in the tomb of Amenmes, cannot have been a wife of his. The reliefs in question are secondary, carved in plaster over the mutilated decoration of the king, reflecting later usurpation of the sepulchre, probably in the 20th dynasty. I know I have already said it, but I will say it once again. The appropriation of temples, tombs and monuments was rife in both Egypt and in Assyria. This usurpation of Amenmeses' tomb should be a wake-up call for archaeologists who need to understand what they are dealing with. Herodotus tells us that Rhodopis was in her prime during the reign of King Amasis, that is, Amenmeses, not at the time of Mycerinus. In other words, Rhodopis was alive a great many years later than the pyramid-building kings. She was a Thracian by birth, and was the slave of a Samian called Iadmon, the son of Hephaestropolis, another of whose slaves was the writer Aesop. He goes on to inform us that Rhodopis stayed in Egypt and was so alluring that she earned a fortune. Strabo claimed that Rhodopis married the king of Egypt, though he did not actually name him. Aelian actually informs us that she married Psammetichus, king of Egypt. Psammetichus is here to be identified as Seti IIa, the person called Psammis by Herodotus, Psamuthis by Africanus, and Psamuthis II, also called Psammetichus by Eusebius, and Amenephis by Josephus. This is the Seti who was the son of Ramses II, also known as Necho II. In the Egyptian records, Rhodopis is known as Tuasre. In her tomb, Tuasre bears the title King's Great Wife by virtue of her marriage to Sethos II. This monument shows Seti II with his queen Tuasre. Note the foreign influences, especially in the headwear, which is an unusual style not to be found represented elsewhere in Egyptian monuments. Despite the foreign appearance, note that the hat still has the uraeus, the representation of the sacred serpent, which is the symbol of royal authority. During the time of Psammetichus I, this being the king we are calling Seti Ib, the father of Ramses II, also known as Necho II, Greek settlers started arriving in Egypt. In earlier times, two peoples are distinguished, the Tehenu and the Temehu, of whom the former were perhaps identical in both race and culture with the Egyptians of the Western Delta, though they were always definitely regarded as foreigners. They wore phallus sheaths, had a large curl hanging from one side of their heads, and carried feathers in their hair. It can be shown that the Tamehu were Edomites, and the Tehenu were Athenians. We are told that the Athenians started arriving in Libya during the time of Psammetichus I, this being the king we are identifying as Seti Ib, who was the father of Ramses II, also known as Necho II. Herodotus informs us that Amasis became a Philhellene, or lover of Greece and Greek culture. Amenmesis is the only Egyptian king depicted with a Libyan curl. The Greeks tell us that Amasis, who was only an army general, was not of royal blood. Archaeologists even argued that Amenmesis was not of royal blood. But because of the lack of awareness that the kings of the ancient world had more than the one name, and because they are not prepared to question or challenge the Manethonian tradition, they cannot make the obvious connections between these kings of the supposed 19th dynasty and those of the 26th dynasty of whom the Greeks have provided written accounts. These are the kings Egyptologists are currently identifying as Psammetichus I, Necho II, Apries and Amasis. None of these have left any records which match the information the Greeks have left us. In fact, for this period of history, we are totally reliant on what the Greek writers tell us, as the Egyptian records are silent on the exploits of these named kings. And when we do have written evidence of a campaign by Ahmose II, it does not accord with what the Greek writers have recorded. Basically, these kings were all Persian satraps who lived a couple of hundred years later. Archaeologists are matching the wrong names to the names being given in the Bible and the Greek records. With the discovery of a sarcophagus in Tyre of a king Ahiram, it has automatically been assumed that it belongs to the biblical king of that name. An inscription by Ethbaal, the son of Ahiram, is likewise automatically assumed to belong to the Ethbaal king of the Sidonians mentioned in 1 Kings 16 verse 31. The problem is that if Ramses II was an alternative name for Pharaoh Necho II, then the archaeological record clearly shows that Ramses II lived before this Hiram. This is assuming, however, that the sarcophagus actually belongs to the King Hiram who lived during the time of King Solomon. We learn from Josephus that the biblical Hiram was succeeded first by his son Baleazaras and then by Abdastatus. Josephus makes no mention of an Ethbaal son of Hiram. Despite this anomaly, archaeologists seem convinced that they have found the sarcophagus of the biblical Hiram. Josephus also tells us that there was an Ethbaal who was king of Tyre during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Furthermore, according to the Talmud, there was a king of Tyre by the name of Hiram who was cruelly put to death by Nebuchadnezzar II. This would then explain the graffito discovered on the side of a tomb shaft of Visachirim, king of Byblos, which states, "Attention! Behold, thou shalt come to grief below here." This makes much more sense in the context of this later period, seeing as how Hiram was cruelly put to death by Nebuchadnezzar. We are also told that Shephet-Baal III, who is understood to have lived in the 5th century BCE, though in reality I estimate he would have been king sometime towards the end of the 4th century BCE, was using an archaic script, something which Albright could not understand. According to the conventional dates, Shephet-Baal III lived around 400 years after Hiram, king of Tyre, so should not have been using the same archaic script. When we make these corrections, we can see how everything fits together more satisfactorily. But no one seems prepared to challenge what Manetho has told us. It may come as a surprise to a lot of people to learn that there were in fact at least two kings with the name Shabaka. The first Shabaka lived during the time of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, when Hezekiah was king of Judah. But there was another Shabaka who was king of Egypt during the time of Alexander the Great. This later Shabaka was called Sabakas, viceroy of Egypt by Arion. Note that a viceroy is someone acting under authority of another king. Nevertheless, he is still a ruler, hence a king. Likewise, there was an Ethiopian king by the name of Taharka, called Tarkas or Tarakas by the Greeks, who was a contemporary of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, and Hezekiah, king of Judah. Another Taharka, who was called Antiochus, king of the Ammonians by Herodotus, lived during the Persian period. Note that Antiochus is a phonetic variation of the name Taharka. This was realised a century ago by Howard Wells. Taharka is the Ethiopian king called Tirhaka in the Bible. He appears in 2 Kings 19 verse 9. It should be noted that this earlier Taharka, who lived during the time of Hezekiah, king of Judah, was called Tarkas by Africanus and Tarakas by Eusebius. The names Taharka, Tirhaka, Tarkas, Tarakas and Etiarchus are all phonetic variations of the same name. When archaeologists find artifacts with the name Shabaka or Taharka, they automatically associate them with the earlier kings with these names. Shepanapt I and II and Ammonadis I and II have been problematic to archaeologists. There is a lot of confusion as to which of the two pairs of women belonged to which period. Ammonadis was both sister and queen of Shabaka. Shepanapt is also called Shabaka's sister. And yet we are told that Ammonadis was the daughter of Taharka. This suggests that Taharka lived before Shabaka. But according to conventional thinking, this is untenable, because it is a known fact that Taharka lived and ruled after Shabaka. Maybe there were two women with exactly the same names, which is what has been assumed. But no one has given any consideration to the possibility that there were two kings with the name Taharka and two kings with the name Shabaka who lived around 200 years apart. Archaeologists have automatically assumed that they are looking at artifacts belonging to the earlier kings with these names. The earlier Shabaka, who I shall here refer to as Shabaka I, ruled shortly before Taharka, who I shall here call Taharka I, whilst the later Shabaka II ruled after Taharka II. As you can see, it all becomes extremely confusing. Let's step back for a moment and look at a passage from the Talmud. Please bear with me, as the reason for doing this will become apparent in a moment. The Talmud records, "It has been taught Cyrus, Darius and Artaxerxes were all one. He was called Cyrus because he was a worthy king, Artaxerxes after his realm, while Darius was his own name." Everyone who reads this passage automatically assumes that this is a reference to Cyrus the Great, the king who issued a decree that the Jews should return to Jerusalem. No one seems to have considered the obvious alternative. Cyrus the Younger was a son of Queen Amestris, who was queen to Xerxes I, son of Darius I. It can be shown that Queen Amestris was the biblical Queen Esther, but for the purpose of this exercise, we shall keep things simple and just concentrate on the facts that are pertinent to this current inquiry. It should be noted that Cyrus the Younger was hit by a number of spears. Darius III was also hit by a number of spears, though Plutarch used the word javelins. Despite this, we are told that Cyrus was ultimately killed by Artaxerxes II Arsaces. Similarly, Darius III was ultimately killed by Artaxerxes V Bessus. I would here like to stress that Bessus is not a Persian name. You will not find the name Bessus in any of the Persian records, nor in any of the Babylonian records of this or any other period. A tablet in the British Museum informs us that Artaxerxes II Arsacus was the king of Persia during the time of Alexander the Great, but no one seems to pay much attention to it. Tom Bowie has this to say about the tablet. BRM 251 has been known for a long time already, and its date formula has always been linked to the Arsacid period, even though it was clear that the tablet was completely different from the other cuneiform tablets from Hellenistic Uruk. Recently, Joannes in 2001 published 4 new texts from Larsa dated to the late Achaemenid and early Hellenistic period from the British Museum, together with 1 text from the Larsa excavations during the 80s. He found several prosopographical links between BRM 251 and these texts. According to Joannes, the title Lugal connected with year 6 could only refer to Darius III or Alexander the Great. Because the royal name mentioned in BRM 251 can in no way be interpreted as Darius or Alexander, Johannes concludes that this formula refers to someone unknown for the moment, but who must be dated to the transitional period between Achaemenid rule and the rule of Alexander the Great. This means that the Arsacus who is mentioned in this tablet is to be identified as Artaxerxes Arsacus, better known to us as Artaxerxes II. Artaxerxes II was the king defeated by Alexander the Great. He is the king known to some Greek writers as Artaxerxes Bessus. If we investigate further, we see that during the time of Cyrus the Younger, the Greeks were pursuing and conquering and making themselves masters everywhere. Who then were these Greek invaders who supposedly arrived 100 years before Alexander the Great? Photius informs us that Cyrus, having revolted against his brother, collected an army composed of both Greeks and barbarians. Clearchus was in command of the Greeks. But Arrian informs us that Clearchus was one of Alexander the Great's generals who was put in command of the Grecian auxiliaries. This means that Cyrus the Younger and Darius III were one and the same person. And yet they are currently dated some 100 years apart. We also know from the Babylonian records that Darius III was also known as Artaxerxes. So when the Talmud tells us that Cyrus, Darius and Artaxerxes were 3 names for the same person, this is actually confirmed by the written evidence when it is corrected in line with the archaeological evidence. It becomes clear, however, that the Greeks, who did not know that Cyrus the Younger and Darius III were one and the same person, have completely messed up the history of this period. There is not enough time to go through the evidence here, but the Persian Achaemenid period can be shown to be grossly overinflated. This chart gives a revised list of Persian kings using the Bible as a template. As you can see, the king the Greeks knew as Cambyses is here called Ahasuerus, a name which, when transliterated into Greek, becomes Xerxes, who is not to be confused with Xerxes, the son of Darius I, who, to save any confusion, I have here referred to as Xerxes IB. Note that Darius I is the king also known as Darius Ochus. Artaxerxes I Longimanus is the king also known to us from the archaeological evidence as Bardir and as Gumata. This king was variously called Pseudo-Smerdis, Sphenodates, Tanyuxaris and Artabanus by the Greeks. The Greek writers have all accredited this king with a reign of 41 years, confusing him with Artaxerxes II, who ruled after Xerxes IB. If you want a full explanation of this revised chronology, I would suggest that you read my paper entitled A Radical Review of the Chaldean and Achaemenid Periods, which you can find on my website. This revised chronological table shows that the Greek writer Herodotus, who is usually said to have lived during the 5th century BCE, was still alive in 320 BCE. This has a profound effect on our understanding of history. To give you some idea of the impact, the destruction of Solomon's temple, which is usually firmly dated to 586 BCE, would have been destroyed around 150 years later, that is, around 431 BCE. This revision also affects our understanding of European history, as the Latin writer Livy informs us that the first settlers to arrive in mainland Europe started arriving at the beginning of the 4th century BCE, shortly before the time of Herodotus. This is a rough outline of the chronology of the period under consideration. As already stated, Shabaka II was a contemporary of Alexander the Great. Meanwhile, Taharqa II would have been a contemporary of Artaxerxes II, the king who was killed by Alexander the Great. Note that Taharqa II here preceded Shabaka. By contrast, the earlier Taharqa, Taharqa I, who was a contemporary of Assyrian king Esarhaddon and Hezekiah king of Judah, succeeded Shabaka I. We are identifying Ramses II as Pharaoh Necho II, which means that he belongs here as a contemporary of Nebuchadnezzar II. But we know that Shabaka was a contemporary of Sennacherib king of Assyria, so we move the whole sequence of Egyptian kings backwards in time, and now Ramses II cannot possibly be Pharaoh Necho II, which means that all the arguments I have put together here must be completely abandoned. And of course we know that Hiram king of Tyre was a contemporary of King Solomon. And we know that Ethbaal was king of the Sidonians during the time of Jeroboam, shortly after the time of Solomon. So the evidence would seemingly overwhelmingly show that the archaeologists are right. But, having demonstrated that there was a Hiram and Ethbaal who were both contemporaries of Nebuchadnezzar II, then, when we make allowance for this, we have a completely different interpretation. But it is not one which anyone seems prepared to accept. You make these corrections to our understanding, and lo and behold, the Egyptian chronology now fits perfectly with the revisions being proposed here. Herodotus informs us that the Bubastite temple at Bubastis was built by Shabaka I. To quote Edward Neville, "At present it is still easy to recognise the correctness of the statement of Herodotus when he says that the whole building was an island, for the beds of the canals which surrounded it are still traceable." But this is actually referring to the temple of Asorcon II. This temple of Asorcon II must have been the one which Herodotus saw and was impressed with when he says, "The gateway is 60 feet high and is decorated with remarkable carved figures some 9 feet in height." It should be noted that the Greek writer Diodorus called Shabaka Actisanes, the king of the Ethiopians, where Actisanes appears to be a transliteration of the name Asorcon. Concerning the temple of Asorcon II, Edward Neville commented, "Surely there must have been a reason why Asorcon II wished Ethiopians to be present at his festival, and why he allowed them to take part in the ceremonies. It is probable that if he drew from Ethiopia priests and religious attendants, he brought also soldiers from the south. It shows that Asorcon's power may have been greater than was suspected." Asorcon II purportedly claimed, "All lands, all countries, the upper Retenu and the lower Retenu are trodden under the feet of this good God." The land of Retenu is the land which we know as the land of Israel. The evidence is showing that these words belong to Shabaka, not Asorkon II. As Edward Naville commented, the mention of the Retenu shows that Asorkon claimed the dominion over the Syrian nations. But it is obvious that in this case it was mere boasting. It was not mere boasting because the words belonged to Shabaka, not Asorkon II. This is a further example of the appropriation of a monument by a later king. In this case, the appropriation of Shabaka's temple by Asorkon II. I earlier put forward arguments to show that Shabaka appears in the Egyptian 6th dynasty as Pepi I. It is therefore interesting to note that, according to Edward Naville, the festival hall to this temple dates from the time of Pepi I. It contained a doorway with an inscription of Pepi I, he informs us. The Israelite ostraca from Samaria in northern Israel were originally dated by George Reisner to the time of Omri and Ahab, kings of Israel. This date was subsequently amended to that of the time of Jeroboam II. Next in chronological order are the ostraca of Samaria, formerly dated in the reign of Ahab, but now certainly to be attributed to the reign of Jeroboam II nearly a century later. These ostraca are invaluable for the light they shed on personal names and political organisation in Israel immediately before the time of Amos. It should be stressed, however, that no inscriptions have been found at Samaria which mention any of these Israelite kings. In fact, the items buried with these supposed Israelite ostraca are for the most part Hellenistic. A number of Egyptian amulets, scarabs and beads were found, but unfortunately none of them can be exactly dated. Most of these objects are known, however, in Egypt from a period contemporaneous with the Israelite occupation of Samaria. The Egyptian gold scarab ring and the Assyrian letter sealing are also assumed to be of the Israelite period on account of their form. The club-shaped pendants ornamented with dotted circles were found in Israelite debris. The other objects are for the most part Hellenistic. Surely, if the majority of these items belong to the later Greek Hellenistic period, would not it be logical to assume that the Israelite artifacts also belonged to this later period? Bear in mind that the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet was still in use as late as the 1st century of the Common Era. Just because archaeologists have found inscriptions in the Paleo-Hebrew script does not mean that it has to be dated to the time of the Israelite kingdom. A scarab belonging to Menkaperre was found in the so-called Israelite debris, which was crude in workmanship and assumed by the excavators to be a local imitation of an Egyptian scarab. Bear in mind that, according to conventional dating, the 18th dynasty king Menkaperre Thutmose will have lived nearly 1,000 years prior to the time of Jeroboam II, to which these Israelite ostraca are now being dated. So the appearance of a scarab in a late strata should be a red flag. The suggestion by the excavators that Israelites were manufacturing scarabs of long-dead kings needs to be challenged. Having demonstrated that Menkaperre was a 21st dynasty king, this would help explain why the so-called Israelite items were buried with objects belonging to the Hellenistic period, as we are now demonstrating that the 21st dynasty dates to the Hellenistic period. Asorkon II's cartouche has been found on a fragment of an alabaster vase under the floor of a building which has been dubbed the Asorkon House. The stratigraphic evidence at Samaria, however, is greatly confused. The explorers naturally felt particular interest in remains from the Hebrew period. Inasmuch as Omri seems to have been the first to build on the hill, they believed that such remains would be found at the lowest stratum. The evidence was, of course, much confused by the building operations of later periods, which easily transferred small objects like pottery from lower to higher levels. The archaeologists involved in excavating the site have started with an assumption about the date of the buildings and have then interpreted the evidence according to their expectations. When artifacts belonging to earlier periods appear at higher levels than expected, they have to make up an excuse. In this case, it has to be the building operations of later periods. Note that the last of these levels is actually immediately below Roman remains. This means that many of the buildings, as well as their contents, must be dated to the Greek Hellenistic period. It is understood that the Asorkon house was built during the post-Israelite period, but archaeologists are assuming that the artifacts below the floor date to the Israelite period of occupation. We are informed that just north of the Ostraca house was a later house, meaning the Asorkon house, whose walls broke through all the courtyard strata, whose floor was higher than the courtyard floor. This house was post-Israelite and pre-Herodian in date. Yet blocks of the courtyard strata were preserved intact in the rooms in this house under the floor. As already stated, during the time of Herodotus, the temple at Bubastis was still known as Shabaka's temple. Remember that we have put forward the argument that Herodotus wrote his history shortly before the time of Alexander the Great, which means that Asorkon II must have lived after this date. The destruction level at Samaria, which archaeologists are dating to the time of Shalmaneser V, may well date to the time of Alexander the Great, who is known to have captured the city and punished the people for the murder of his governor, who he had placed over them. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah show that Samaria was occupied during the Persian period. Owing to the destruction of the buildings of the Babylonio-Grecian period, it was not possible to identify a particular sort of debris with this Persian period, we are told. If Herodotus lived during the Persian period, this places Asorkon II to some date during either the late Persian or early Greek periods. This means that the so-called Israelite Ostraca, which archaeologists are dating to the Israelite occupation period, more correctly belongs to the late Persian and early Greek periods. Archaeology is a floor laid on many pillars. If you remove one of the pillars, you may affect the integrity of the floor, but the other pillars will continue to hold the floor up. It is only when you remove a number of pillars at once that you can cause the floor to collapse so that you can see the true floor which lies beneath. Had I not explained about Shabaka and Taharqa, shown that Hiram and Ethbar lived during the time of Nebuchadnezzar II, shown that Cyrus the Younger was another name for Darius III, archaeologists would simply have fallen back on these pillars to support the floor they have built for themselves. Bear in mind that archaeology is nothing more than interpretation of data. When that data is wrongly interpreted, you end up with a misleading view of history. The brain is a delicate piece of machinery. Once it has been fed a lot of information, especially when that information has been used to make other connections, when conflicting data comes along, no matter how correct that new information may be, the brain will start by rejecting the new data and will even make up excuses for not accepting it. Sometimes it can take decades before the new information becomes accepted by mainstream scholarship. If, for example, we look at the so-called Hittites, despite evidence produced around 60 years ago which clearly shows that they were not Hittites, they are still to this day regarded as Hittites. Likewise, despite Zahi Hawass stating in 1985 that the statuette of the 4th dynasty king Khufu is of late date and does not represent the 4th dynasty king of this name, the statuette is still today, some 40 years later, being treated by the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and other respected sources as being a representation of a 4th dynasty king and is still being dated to that dynasty. And then there are the 5th and 6th dynasty artefacts, many of which have been redated by Sir William Flinders Petrie to a much later date. But the strata from which those objects were sourced is still being regarded as being 5th and 6th dynasty respectively. The revised information is just being brushed under the carpet and ignored. The original interpretations have become so well established that they are now difficult to overturn. The following words of wisdom taken from the New Testament Gospel of Luke is worth quoting here. And he, that is Jesus, spake also a parable unto them. No man putteth a piece of a new garment upon an old. If otherwise, then both the new maketh a rent, and the piece that was taken out of the new agreeth not with the old. And no man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine will burst the bottles and be spilled, and the bottles shall perish. But new wine must be put into new bottles, and both are preserved. And this is the important part. No man also having drunk old wine straightway desireth new, for he saith the old is better. When someone has devoted their whole life to studying their particular subject and have convinced themselves that their understanding is correct, it takes a lot to change their way of thinking. In 1953, Emanuel Velikovsky wrote a book entitled Ages in Chaos, which demonstrated that the Egyptian 18th dynasty was contemporary with the Davidic Solomonic period. He followed this up in 1977 with Peoples of the Sea, in which he demonstrated that the Egyptian 20th dynasty, which is usually dated to the 12th to 11th centuries BCE, was contemporary with the Persian period of history around 800 years later, and demonstrated that Ramses III was the king the Greek writers called Nectanebo. A year later, in 1978, he released Ramses II and His Time, demonstrating that Ramses II was the person the Greeks called Necho II, a king who was a contemporary of Josiah, king of Judah. Despite all the compelling evidence, the academic response was totally unprofessional. They were extremely hostile in their attack on Velikovsky's work. They honed in on the one or two mistakes he made and blew them out of all proportion, completely ignoring the overwhelming evidence which suggested that Velikovsky was right. This is what I mean when I say that the brain rejects information which does not accord with what it has been taught, as well as how other pillars will be used to continue to support conventional views. It does not help when archaeologists have to specialise in only a small area of history. The inevitable unfortunate consequence of this is that someone who is highly learned in, say, the Egyptian 18th dynasty will often only have a relatively superficial understanding of other parts of Egyptian history or of any other nation's histories. Whilst this practice may have its benefits, when you specialise in this way, it is not always easy to see the complete picture. So, to summarise, we have demonstrated that the 12th and 18th dynasties were one and the same period of history. We have shown that the 13th dynasty has been used as a dumping ground for archaeologists for names which they have been unable to fit elsewhere. We have shown that the 4th dynasty is nothing more than the latter part of the 18th in another form. And we have shown that the 19th dynasty coincided with the final years of the Kingdom of Judah before being taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar II, with Ramses II being identified as the biblical pharaoh Necho. We have also shown that archaeologists have assigned to Shabaka and Taharqa of the time of the Assyrian king Sennacherib and Esarhaddon artifacts which more correctly belong to the later kings with these names. They have done exactly the same with artifacts which belong to Hiram and Ethbaal, who lived during the time of Nebuchadnezzar II. In short, we have put far too much trust in the works of Manetho and his contemporaries, whose works we have hopefully shown to be nothing more than cleverly contrived dynastic lists of Egyptian kings. The Egyptian chronology as it currently stands is in a mess. Clearly, we do not have the time here to cover all of the available evidence, but this video presentation should provide you with a good general overview of the Egyptian history, showing the corrections which need to be made to bring it in line with the biblical history. When we do make these corrections, we discover the great influence Israel had on Egypt. Hatshepsut's temple, for example, is said by Edward Neville to be of Proto-Doric style. In a separate video, I will show that the Dorians who were responsible for this Doric style were Israelites who came from the city of Dor in northern Israel, which means that these temples were built by Israelite contractors working in Egypt. This is presumably how Queen Hatshepsut learned of Solomon's wisdom. We see from documents from this period that trade between Israel and Egypt was strong. As Pierre Montet records, from the beginning of the 18th dynasty until the time of Ramses III, the Egyptians constantly intervened in Syria, or more correctly the land of Israel, and claimed tribute from the vanquished. This took the form of timber, horses, oxen, cereals and metals. The military leaders were also quite willing to accept manufactured goods, such as chariots, valuable weapons, and the curious vases or bowls incrustated with precious stones and used for holding bunches of papyrus or other ornamental plants, which was subsequently offered to the god Amun of Thebes. The Egyptians were very fond of these objects and eventually copied them. During this period, the craze for Syrian products introduced a host of Semitic terms into the Egyptian language. And yet, due to our corrupted understanding of Egyptian history, this important bit of information has been hidden from us. I am also able to demonstrate that the Egyptian 1st, 3rd, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 18th dynasty was contemporary with the Davidic Solomonic period. This represents a reduction of more than 2,000 years in the Egyptian chronology, which is quite a significant amount of time. Consider what happened 2,000 years ago from today to get some idea of the impact these corrections have on our understanding of Egyptian history. Bear in mind that these amendments also have an impact on every other nation's history. When we come to look at the Assyrian chronology, we shall find that the same errors have been made there as well. The Rassam cylinder, for example, a clay cylinder which purportedly describes the wars of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, is a forgery dating to the time of the Persian Achaemenid period. It can be shown that the long list of Egyptian kings mentioned therein were kings of Egypt during the time of Artaxerxes II, king of Persia. Likewise, I shall demonstrate that the Greek chronology also needs to be reduced. It can be demonstrated that the Dorians, who supposedly arrived in Greece in the 12th century BCE, actually arrived during the time of Nebuchadnezzar II, around 700 years later than we are led to believe. This will remove the 350-year dark age in Greek history, during which period there is supposedly a complete absence of archaeological evidence, though we shall show that we are talking of significantly more than 350 years. But all of this will be left for a separate video. Note that the Great Pyramid at Giza, which is usually dated to around 3000 BCE, was more correctly built in the 7th century BCE. I can also disclose that the exodus from Egypt under the leadership of Moses occurred during the end of what is being referred to as the pre-dynastic period, long before Manetho's first dynasty. This is how corrupt our understanding of Egyptian history actually is. These Egyptian king lists are part of one big con, and everyone has fallen for it hook, line and sinker. Basically, we have accepted at face value the fraudulent works and doctored monumental evidence of the Egyptians without due scrutiny, even when we have realised that it is wrong. Do you not think that it is about time we set the record straight?